The ship of Theseus paradox raises an interesting question. If every part of a ship is replaced over time, is it still the same ship? And what if the original parts are used to rebuild another ship? Which one can be called the true ship of Theseus? Let's start by imagining a ship, the ship of Theseus, that is docked and begins to slowly wear down. Over time, one of its planks is replaced. Then the mast is replaced. Next, a few ropes and sails are swapped out. Eventually, nearly every part of the ship is replaced. The question is it still the same ship? This seems like a simple idea. If you replace something piece by piece, it's still the same ship, right? It's just been fixed and updated. But let's dig a bit deeper. If you were to take all the old parts that were removed over time, would that still be the same ship? If you rebuild it with these original pieces, is it the true ship of Theseus? Here's where things get tricky. If a ship is made from different parts, and one by one each part is replaced, is the identity of the ship tied to its individual parts? Or is it tied to the whole ship as it exists at any given moment? Some might say that once you replace all the parts, the ship changes its identity. Others might argue that the ship stays the same because it remains whole and functional, even though its parts have changed. Let's imagine a different situation. Picture two ships. One is the ship that's been gradually replaced over time, and the other is made from the original parts. Which one do you consider the true ship of Theseus? If the ship that was rebuilt with the original parts sails on the sea, it's made of the very same materials as the original ship. But the ship that has had its parts replaced over time has sailed the seas, undergone wear and tear, and kept going as the same ship. You can see that both ships are tied to different ideas of what same means. One is the same ship by its parts, and the other is the same ship by its ongoing journey and history. The ship that was rebuilt with the original parts has all the physical markers of the past, but the ship that has gradually been replaced still carries the legacy of the experiences and journeys it had while it was intact. Now, take a moment to think about cars, homes, or even your favorite piece of technology. We've all seen something old that has been fixed and updated over time, with parts swapped in and out. Is that the same object? If you keep repairing your car, replacing parts as they break or wear out, it still feels like your car. But if you used the original parts to make a new car, which one would be the true car? Consider a scenario where you own a boat. Over years, the wooden hull starts to rot, and you replace a few boards here and there. Eventually, all the wood has been replaced. Yet the boat still floats. It still holds memories of your trips, the same paint on its side, the same sailcloth from the beginning. The boat still has its original purpose and design, but all its parts are new. Can you still call it the same boat? On the other hand, suppose someone took all the old boards and rebuilt the boat. Would that be the true version of your boat? It may look identical on the surface, but something has changed. The rebuilt boat may not have the same history or wear. It might feel new, and even if the boards are the same, it has no memories attached to it. There's a sense in which the rebuilt boat feels like a replacement, even though it's made of the original parts. This brings us to another question. Does identity belong to the parts or to the whole? When you talk about a ship, a car, or a house, do you mean the collection of parts that make it up? Or do you mean the entire experience, the use, and the history that it carries? If a person replaces every part of their body over time, cells die and regenerate, are they still the same person? In this case, the person stays the same because the history of their life is preserved in the memories and experiences that they've lived through. So perhaps in the ship of Theseus paradox, the ship stays the same not because its planks are the same, but because it's still the same vessel, still serving its purpose, and still living through its experiences. But it's not always that simple. When you take something apart and put it back together, you can lose something of its original form. It's a little like building a puzzle. If you take a completed puzzle and scatter the pieces, they are still the same pieces. But the picture is lost until it's put back together. So in one way, the identity of the ship might depend on the way it is reassembled. Even if it's made of the same parts, something might feel different about a ship that has been rebuilt versus one that's slowly changed piece by piece. In the case of the ship of Theseus, if the ship's purpose is to carry out voyages and adventures, then maybe the identity of the ship is tied to its continued function and role. If it's the same ship, it still has that history, that track record of traveling the seas and carrying stories. But if you're focused on the physical parts, the ship changes as the parts are replaced. The same is true for the rebuilt ship, made from the original parts. It may carry some physical legacy, but it lacks the history of the ongoing journey. In the end, the question isn't just about the ship. It's about what we mean when we say something is the same. Is the ship the same because of the material parts, or is it the same because of its continuity and history? Whether the ship stays the same depends on whether you see its identity as tied to the parts, to the experience, or to the journey. Both perspectives have their merit, but both also show that the idea of sameness is more complex than it might first appear. The liar paradox is a statement that seems simple at first, but quickly leads to a confusing situation. It says, "This sentence is false." The problem is that if the sentence is true, then what it says must be true. But what it says is that the sentence is false. If the sentence is false, then what it says is not true, meaning it must be true. So we find ourselves in a loop where the sentence can't be true and can't be false at the same time. To see why this is a paradox, let's break it down. If the sentence is true, it must be false because that's what it says. But if it's false, then it must be true because it's saying that it is false. This creates a contradiction. We're stuck because the sentence can't be true without being false, and it can't be false without being true. So it leads us in circles with no clear answer. Let's look at a simple example to understand this better. Imagine you have a friend who always lies. They say, "I am lying right now." What do you do with that? If they are lying, then the statement they made is not true. But if the statement isn't true, then they must be telling the truth. So they're both lying and telling the truth at the same time. This is a similar problem to the liar paradox. It's a statement that can't logically be true or false, which makes it very tricky to figure out. The liar paradox raises a deeper question about language and truth. How do we understand statements like this? What does it even mean for something to be true or false? In most situations, we think of sentences as either true or false. If I say, "The sky is blue," and the sky is blue, the sentence is true. If I say, "The sky is green," and the sky isn't green, the sentence is false. But the liar paradox messes with this idea. It forces us to ask, what if the truth of a sentence isn't clear? One way to look at this paradox is to consider the idea of self-reference. The sentence, "This sentence is false," refers to itself. It's talking about its own truth value, and that's where the trouble starts. Most sentences are not self-referential. For example, "The sky is blue" doesn't talk about itself. It just describes the sky. But when a sentence refers to itself, like in the case of the liar paradox, it gets tangled up in its own logic. Now, you might wonder if the sentence is just a trick of language or if it points to something deeper. For example, if we treat the statement as just a silly game with words, it might not seem very important. But if we think about how we use language to describe reality, the paradox forces us to reconsider how we make sense of the world. How do we decide what's true when the rules of language break down? One possible way to handle the paradox is to say that the sentence is neither true nor false. Some people argue that sentences like this don't fit into the usual categories of truth and falsehood. They suggest that the liar paradox is simply a sentence that can't be classified in the usual way. It's like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. It doesn't work because the sentence doesn't follow the normal rules of truth. Another way to approach the paradox is to say that it's a problem of language, not of truth itself. In this view, the liar paradox exposes the limitations of how we use language. Maybe our language can't handle certain kinds of self-reference, and that's what causes the confusion. The paradox doesn't tell us that truth itself is broken. It tells us that our way of talking about truth has its limits. Some philosophers have tried to solve the paradox by creating new systems of logic. One approach is called paraconsistent logic, which allows for statements to be both true and false at the same time. This may sound strange, but it's a way to deal with situations where contradictions arise. In paraconsistent logic, the liar paradox doesn't cause a breakdown. Instead, it shows that truth can be more complex than we usually think. Another approach is to use what's called relevant logic. This kind of logic focuses on the relationship between statements, not just their truth values. In relevant logic, a statement might be considered true or false based on how it fits with other statements in a system. So, in this case, the liar paradox might be treated differently than it would be in traditional logic. Despite these attempts to solve the paradox, it still presents a challenge. The basic problem is that the liar paradox forces us to rethink what it means for a statement to be true or false. It pushes us to think about the nature of truth, language, and logic in new ways. Let's consider another example to make this clearer. Imagine someone says, "The next statement is true." Then they say, "The previous statement is false." This creates a loop, much like the liar paradox. If the first statement is true, then the second statement must be true, which makes the first statement false. But if the first statement is false, then the second statement must be false, which makes the first statement true. Again, we find ourselves in a situation where we can't determine if the statements are true or false without causing a contradiction. So, the liar paradox isn't just about one tricky sentence. It's about understanding how we deal with statements that challenge our usual ways of thinking. When a sentence refers to its own truth, it leads us into confusion because the standard rules of logic don't seem to apply. And while some people try to solve the paradox with new systems of logic, the liar paradox still remains a powerful reminder that language and truth are not always as straightforward as they seem. Zeno's paradoxes are a series of puzzles that challenge our understanding of motion and time. One of the most famous is the Achilles and the tortoise paradox. In this thought experiment, Achilles, who is known for his speed, races a tortoise. The tortoise is given a head start, but despite Achilles being much faster, Zeno argues that Achilles can never overtake the tortoise. At first, this might seem impossible, but when we break it down, we see how Zeno's argument plays on our understanding of infinite steps. The paradox starts with a race between Achilles and the tortoise. Suppose the tortoise is given a 10-meter head start. Achilles, running much faster, will be able to cover that 10 meters quickly. But Zeno argues that by the time Achilles reaches the tortoise's starting point, the tortoise will have moved a little further ahead. So now, Achilles has to run to the new position of the tortoise. But by the time he reaches that point, the tortoise will have moved again, and so on. Each time Achilles reaches the spot where the tortoise was, the tortoise will have moved ahead by a smaller and smaller distance. The paradox suggests that because there are infinite steps for Achilles to complete, reaching the tortoise's current position, then the new position, and so on, Achilles will never actually catch up. Every time he gets closer, the tortoise moves a little further. So even though Achilles is faster, Zeno concludes that he will never overtake the tortoise because the number of steps is infinite. To understand this better, think about a more everyday example. Imagine you want to walk across a room, But first, you have to get halfway there. Once you've reached halfway, you need to get halfway to that point, then halfway to the next point, and so on. It seems like you'd never actually reach the other side, because there are an infinite number of halfway points. In theory, you'd always be getting closer, but never actually making it. Zeno's paradox plays on the idea of infinity. The idea that you can always divide a distance in half sounds logical, but it leads to the conclusion that you can never finish the task. This is because, according to Zeno, no matter how fast Achilles runs, he must first cover an infinite number of smaller distances, which seems impossible. At this point, it's easy to think Zeno's paradox must be correct. After all, the argument seems reasonable. But the key to understanding this paradox lies in how we handle infinity. In real life, Achilles would easily overtake the tortoise. The reason is that although there are an infinite number of steps, the total distance Achilles needs to cover isn't infinite. The distances he has to run get smaller and smaller, and as they shrink, the total time it takes for him to complete the race also shrinks. Mathematically, we can calculate the total time Achilles would take to reach the tortoise. Each step is smaller than the last, and while the number of steps is infinite, the sum of the distances converges to a finite number. In other words, even though there are infinite steps, the total distance that Achilles has to cover is finite and can be completed in a finite amount of time. Let's break this down with an example. Suppose Achilles covers 10 meters in 1 second. In that case, the tortoise might start 10 meters ahead, but Achilles runs faster. The first step is for Achilles to cover that 10 meters. By the time he reaches the point where the tortoise started, the tortoise has moved a small distance, let's say 1 meter. Achilles now needs to cover the additional 1 meter. After that, the tortoise has moved another fraction of a meter, and so on. While there are an infinite number of steps, each step gets smaller and smaller, and the total time taken for Achilles to finish the race is still finite. In fact, Zeno's paradox ignores the fact that the distance covered in each step becomes so small that it no longer significantly impacts the overall race. After a certain point, the tortoise moves so little that it doesn't matter in the context of the race. Achilles may have to take an infinite number of steps, but the total time is still finite. In real life, Achilles will overtake the tortoise in a matter of seconds, no matter how many steps there are. Zeno's paradox is more about how we think about infinity rather than a statement about real-world events. It challenges our intuition, forcing us to think differently about motion, time, and space. We tend to think of motion as happening in continuous steps, but when we break it down, we see that those steps can become infinitely small. This plays with our understanding of how infinite series work. Zeno's argument works on a logical level because it uses the idea of an infinite sequence of steps, but it doesn't take into account the fact that these infinite steps can still add up to a finite result. The key insight comes from mathematics. The sum of an infinite series of decreasing numbers can still be finite. This is what allows Achilles to eventually pass the tortoise. The paradox also speaks to the way we understand time. In the paradox, we are led to believe that the passage of time is also broken up into infinite moments. However, time doesn't freeze at each step. It keeps moving forward, and each of these smaller steps happens in a finite amount of time. The illusion that Achilles can't catch the tortoise arises when we treat time and motion as if they were purely a series of infinite moments, without considering the way that motion actually works in the physical world. What Zeno's paradox really shows us is that sometimes our intuitions about the world need to be adjusted, especially when it comes to infinity. On the surface, it seems like the infinite number of steps would prevent Achilles from ever catching the tortoise. But once we understand how infinite sequences can add up to a finite total, the paradox loses its power. Achilles can, in fact, pass the tortoise with no problem, because the total amount of time needed to do so is finite, even though there are an infinite number of steps. In the end, Zeno's paradox may seem like a simple puzzle, but it introduces deep questions about how we think about space, time, and infinity. It shows us that even simple problems can challenge the way we understand the world. But in the real world, of course, Achilles would overtake the tortoise in no time. In a small town, there is a barber who shaves all the men who do not shave themselves. The puzzle, known as the Barber Paradox, comes from asking a seemingly simple question. Who shaves the barber? Does he shave himself or not? At first glance, this might seem like a harmless question, but it leads to a situation that is impossible to resolve logically. Let's think about it step by step. According to the rule, the barber shaves all those who do not shave themselves. So, if a man shaves himself, the barber does not shave him. If a man does not shave himself, the barber shaves him. Now imagine that the barber is one of the men in the town. The rule still applies to him. He shaves those who do not shave themselves. But here's where the paradox kicks in. If the barber shaves himself, then according to the rule, he should not shave himself, because he only shaves those who do not shave themselves. But if he does not shave himself, then he must shave himself, because he shaves all those who do not shave themselves. This creates a contradiction. If the barber shaves himself, then he must not shave himself. And if he doesn't shave himself, then he must shave himself. So, there is no way to determine if the barber shaves himself or not. This paradox seems like a simple logical puzzle, but it has deeper implications about how we think about rules, self-reference, and logic. The Barber Paradox is a type of logical paradox called a self-referential paradox. This means that the statement or rule in question refers to itself in a way that leads to confusion. The barber's rule refers to who shaves him, but by doing so, it creates a situation where the rule can't be applied consistently. To see why this is a problem, let's consider another example. Imagine a list of all the numbers from 1 to 100. Now, suppose we say that every number on the list must either be odd or even. This seems straightforward. But what if we add a new rule that says, every number that is both odd and even must be removed from the list? This would lead to a contradiction, because no number can be both odd and even, but the rule refers to a situation that doesn't make sense. The list now has a self-referential problem, much like the Barber Paradox. The Barber Paradox points out something important about how we think about rules. When we make a rule, we have to be careful about how it applies to itself. In the case of the barber, the rule that the barber shaves those who do not shave themselves is self-referential. It refers to the barber himself, which creates a loop that can't be resolved. This kind of paradox is a reminder that some logical systems can't be complete or consistent when they include self-references. Paradox also brings up questions about how we define categories. In this case, the barber is a person who fits into two categories, those who shave themselves and those who do not. The rule that governs him depends on which category he fits into. But because the rule is self-referential, it leads to a contradiction. This suggests that when we try to define categories too strictly, especially when they refer to themselves, we can run into problems. One way to look at the Barber Paradox is to think of it as a problem with the rules of logic themselves. The paradox doesn't just reveal an issue with the barber's rule. It shows that certain types of rules lead to contradictions when they refer to themselves. In a way, the Barber Paradox is a warning about the limits of logic. It suggests that some logical systems cannot handle self-referential statements without breaking down. The paradox also challenges our usual way of thinking about categories. We tend to think of categories as clear-cut and fixed. In the case of the barber, there are two clear categories: people who shave themselves and people who do not. The barber fits into both categories, but the rule doesn't allow him to belong to both categories at the same time without causing a contradiction. This raises the question of whether our categories are always as clear as we think they are. In many situations, we may find that the lines between categories are not as sharp as we would like them to be. In real life, the Barber Paradox is not something we typically encounter, but the paradox is useful for thinking about situations where rules or categories are self-referential or where logic seems to break down. It can help us understand the limitations of our thinking and the challenges we face when dealing with complex systems. Let's think about a different example of a self-referential paradox. Imagine a library where the rule is that books that have an odd number of pages must be placed on one shelf, and books with an even number of pages must be placed on another shelf. Now, let's suppose that the library has a book with an odd number of pages, but it also has a rule that says books with an odd number of pages should be placed on the even-numbered shelf. This creates a paradox because the book with an odd number of pages must go on the even shelf, but it also must go on the odd shelf. Just like the Barber Paradox, this situation creates a contradiction because of self-referential rules. In both the Barber Paradox and the book example, the rule creates a loop that leads to a situation where no consistent answer is possible. This highlights a key point. When rules or categories refer to themselves, they can lead to contradictions that are hard or even impossible to resolve. The Barber Paradox shows that logical systems must be carefully designed to avoid such contradictions. Ultimately, the Barber Paradox is not just a fun puzzle, but a way of thinking about the limits of logic, rules, and categories. It shows that self-referential situations often lead to confusion and contradiction. This type of paradox teaches us to be cautious when creating rules that refer to themselves, and reminds us that sometimes the logical systems we use need to be reconsidered or revised to avoid contradictions. The Bootstrap Paradox is a strange and thought-provoking concept. It involves time travel and raises the question of authorship. In one version of the paradox, a person from the future goes back in time and gives Shakespeare a copy of his own works, including plays and sonnets. Shakespeare then publishes them as his own. The puzzle comes when you ask, who is the original author of Shakespeare's works? Is it Shakespeare or the person who traveled back in time? To understand this paradox, let's break it down with an example. Imagine someone from the future travels back to the late 1500s and meets Shakespeare. This person, knowing that Shakespeare is famous for his works, gives him a manuscript of all his plays and poems, exactly the works Shakespeare will later be known for. Shakespeare then publishes them, and history unfolds just as we know it. But here's the catch. Who wrote Shakespeare's works? It seems like the manuscript didn't come from Shakespeare himself. It came from someone else, from the future. Now, let's think about the consequences. The person from the future has a copy of Shakespeare's works, but they didn't write it themselves. They got it from Shakespeare in the first place. In other words, Shakespeare never wrote the works. He only received them from the time traveler. The paradox is that these works seem to have no true origin. The question becomes, who is the true author? It's as if the works are being passed around in a circle with no clear starting point. This paradox is called the Bootstrap Paradox because it seems like the works bootstrap, or create, themselves. The works exist, but no one actually creates them. They just keep being handed from one person to another, with no one ever truly writing them. The name comes from the old idea of pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, something that sounds impossible, but is suggested in the paradox because of the circular flow of information and creation. One way to think about the paradox is by considering the idea of causality. Normally, when something happens, we assume there's a clear cause for it. If Shakespeare wrote his plays, the cause is that he sat down and wrote them. But in the Bootstrap Paradox, there is no clear cause. The person from the future didn't write the works. They only gave them to Shakespeare, who published them. The works seem to have no origin at all. In this loop, The works exist because they were given to Shakespeare by someone who got them from Shakespeare, creating a situation where the usual cause and effect relationship is broken. Now, let's consider how this might play out in real life. Imagine that you are reading Shakespeare's works in the future, and you come across the paradox. You know that Shakespeare is widely considered the author of these works. But in this strange time loop, it seems that the works have no clear origin. This creates a deep question about the nature of authorship. Does it matter who originally wrote the works, or is it enough that the works exist and have been published? Think about how this plays out with other works of art. What if an artist created a masterpiece, and then, in the future, someone traveled back in time and gave the artist a copy of their own masterpiece? The artist then publishes it as their own work. Who is the true creator of the piece? Is it the artist or the person from the future who provided the copy? This could apply to any kind of creation: books, music, paintings, raising the question of where ideas actually come from. Are they original, or are they merely part of a loop where ideas are handed down from the future? In this paradox, there's another important element to consider: time travel itself. If we accept that time travel is possible, it opens up many possibilities. In the Bootstrap Paradox, the act of going back in time and giving Shakespeare the copy of his works is itself part of the cause of those works existing. Without time travel, the works wouldn't have existed in the first place. But once they are published by Shakespeare, they enter the historical record, and the time traveler can access them in the future. This creates a loop that seems impossible to break. It's as if the works exist simply because they exist, with no beginning or end. One way to think about the paradox is through the lens of information. The works are passed around, but they are not created by anyone in particular. The information about the works moves through time, but there is no single person who can be said to have created them. In this way, the paradox challenges our usual understanding of how information and creativity work. If information can travel through time, then perhaps the very idea of originality needs to be reconsidered. What does it mean to create something if that thing has already existed, simply waiting to be discovered? The paradox also touches on the idea of time itself. If time is a linear flow, then events must happen in a particular order. A person from the future cannot give Shakespeare a manuscript of his works if Shakespeare has not yet written them. But in the Bootstrap Paradox, time seems to loop back on itself, creating a situation where the normal rules of time no longer apply. This challenges our understanding of how the past, present, and future are connected. When we think about the Bootstrap Paradox, it's easy to get lost in the circular logic and the idea that time itself might be fluid. The paradox is designed to make us question how we view causality, creation, and the passage of time. It shows that in a world with time travel, the traditional rules of cause and effect may not always apply. What's more, it raises a fundamental question about where ideas and creations come from in the first place. Are they truly original, or are they simply part of a larger loop of time? In the case of Shakespeare's works, the paradox leaves us with an unsettling idea. There may be no true original author. The works are simply part of an endless loop, handed from one person to another. In this strange version of reality, creativity becomes less about individual authorship and more about the flow of information through time. But if we accept this, we have to ask ourselves, does it really matter where the works come from as long as they exist? In the end, the Bootstrap Paradox is a puzzle that forces us to think more deeply about the nature of creation, time, and the way the world works. The Grandfather Paradox is one of the most famous thought experiments in time travel. It's a problem that raises a fundamental question about causality and the nature of time itself. The paradox goes like this. Suppose you could travel back in time. While there, you prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother. As a result, your grandfather never marries, and your parent is never born. If your parent isn't born, you can't exist. But if you don't exist, how could you have traveled back in time in the first place? Let's break it down further. Imagine that you are born, and at some point, you discover time travel. Eager to test it out, you go back to a time before your parents were born. You find your grandfather and prevent him from meeting your grandmother. This action causes a chain of events where your parent is never born, and as a result, you are never born either. Now, here's the paradox. If you are never born, how could you have gone back in time to stop your grandfather from meeting your grandmother? If you don't exist in the future, you can't travel back to the past. This creates a logical loop. You're stuck in a situation where your actions in the past make it impossible for you to have been there in the first place. The paradox is unsettling because it seems to violate the basic rules of cause and effect. Normally, we think that our actions in the present can affect the future. If you do something now, it might change what happens later. But in the grandfather paradox, the problem is that your actions in the past change your own existence in such a way that you can't have performed those actions in the first place. This leads to the question of how time works. Is time a straight line where past, present, and future follow each other in a predictable order? Or is time something more flexible, where the past can be influenced by actions taken in the future? The grandfather paradox suggests that, if time travel is possible, the traditional understanding of time might need to be reconsidered. If you can change the past in such a way that you no longer exist, it raises serious questions about how events can be connected. One possible solution to the grandfather paradox is the idea of multiple timelines. In this scenario, when you travel back in time and change something, you don't erase your own timeline. Instead, you create a new branch of reality, a new timeline, where the events unfold differently. In this new timeline, you may not be born, but the original timeline where you were born remains unchanged. This idea suggests that the past can be changed, but it doesn't change the reality that already exists for the time traveler. For example, let's say you prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother. In the new timeline, you may never be born, but in the timeline you originally came from, you still exist. This way, your actions don't erase your own existence, but they create a different version of the future. In this model, the paradox doesn't arise because the time traveler still exists in their original timeline, even though they've changed something in the past. Another idea is that time may not allow changes to the past. Some people argue that time travel could be impossible, or that if time travel were possible, it would somehow prevent paradoxes from happening. In this view, even if you went back in time, some event would always occur to make sure your grandfather still meets your grandmother, or you would never be able to change anything that would affect your own birth. This idea suggests that the universe has some built-in mechanism to prevent paradoxes, ensuring that events unfold in a way that keeps the timeline intact. There's also the possibility that the grandfather paradox isn't really a paradox at all. It could be that our understanding of time and causality is simply incomplete. Perhaps, if time travel were possible, the rules governing how the past, present, and future interact would be far more complex than we currently understand. The paradox could be an artifact of our limited perspective, an example of how we struggle to think about time when it's not constrained by the rules we're used to. But in the absence of a clear solution, the grandfather paradox remains a compelling puzzle. It forces us to confront the limits of our understanding of time, causality, and the nature of reality. If we can change the past, how can we be sure that the future we came from still exists? If we can travel back in time, can we really affect the past without creating contradictions? These questions challenge our assumptions about how the world works and how time flows. Let's imagine a more everyday example to help illustrate the paradox. Imagine you have a family heirloom, a ring passed down through generations. One day, you travel back in time to give the ring to your great-grandfather, ensuring that it gets passed down to future generations. When you return to your original time, you find that you have the same ring in your possession. But if your great-grandfather already had the ring, where did it originally come from? It's as though the ring exists without ever having been created. The grandfather paradox works similarly. It suggests that the past can be altered. But that change seems to erase the very conditions that allowed the change to happen in the first place. Even if time travel is possible, the grandfather paradox shows us that any attempt to change the past could lead to logical contradictions. It suggests that time may be far more complicated than we think, and that changes to the past could have far-reaching consequences that we can't predict. It's not just a puzzle about time travel. It's a puzzle about how the universe is structured and how everything, from time to causality, is connected. In the end, the grandfather paradox is a way of exploring the limits of our understanding of time. It raises important questions about the nature of cause and effect, the relationship between the past, present, and future, and the possibility of time travel. Even though we don't yet know how time travel works, if it's even possible, the paradox challenges us to think deeply about how time might function in ways that we can't fully grasp. The grandfather paradox is a famous thought experiment in time travel that questions the nature of causality and time itself. The paradox goes like this. Suppose you could travel back in time and prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother. As a result, your grandfather never marries and your parent is never born. Without a parent, you can't exist. But if you don't exist, how could you have traveled back in time in the first place? Let's break it down. Imagine you're born and one day you discover time travel. You travel back to a time before your parents were born and you stop your grandfather from meeting your grandmother. This prevents your parent from being born, and consequently, you aren't born either. Now, here's the paradox. If you're never born, how could you have traveled back in time to stop your grandfather from meeting your grandmother? If you don't exist in the future, you can't travel back to the past. This creates a loop. Your actions in the past make it impossible for you to have been there in the first place. This paradox challenges the basic rules of cause and effect. Normally, we think our actions in the present can affect the future. But in the grandfather paradox, your actions in the past change your own existence in a way that prevents you from even existing to perform those actions. The paradox forces us to think about how time works. Is time like a straight line where past, present, and future follow each other in a predictable order? Or is time more flexible, where the past can be influenced by actions from the future? The grandfather paradox suggests that if time travel is possible, our understanding of time might need to be reconsidered. Changing the past in such a way that you no longer exist raises questions about how events are connected. One possible solution to the paradox is the idea of multiple timelines. In this view, when you travel back in time and change something, you don't erase your original timeline. Instead, you create a new branch of reality where events unfold differently. For example, if you prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, you may not be born in the new timeline, but in the original timeline where you were born and traveled back in time, you still exist. This idea suggests that the past can be changed, but it doesn't affect the timeline from which you came. Another solution is that time might prevent changes to the past. Some argue that even if time travel were possible, the universe would have some mechanism to prevent paradoxes. In this view, no matter what you did in the past, something would occur to ensure your grandfather still meets your grandmother, or your actions would never affect your own birth. This theory suggests that time itself would stop paradoxes from occurring, preserving the timeline. There's also the possibility that the grandfather paradox isn't truly a paradox, but rather a reflection of our incomplete understanding of time. Perhaps if time travel were possible, the rules of time and causality are far more complex than we realize. The paradox might be an example of how we struggle to understand time outside the limitations we experience. Without a clear solution, the grandfather paradox remains a compelling puzzle. It forces us to question how time, causality, and reality function. If we can change the past, how can we be sure that the future we came from still exists? If we can travel back in time, can we affect the past without creating contradictions? These questions challenge our understanding of how time flows and how events are connected. A more relatable example might help illustrate the paradox. Suppose you have a family heirloom, a ring passed down for generations. One day, you decide to travel back in time to give the ring to your great-grandfather, ensuring it's passed down through the family. When you return to your original time, you still have the same ring. But if your great-grandfather already had the ring, where did it come from? It seems like the ring exists without ever having been created. This situation mirrors the grandfather paradox. Actions taken in the past can seem to cause something that couldn't exist, creating a loop with no origin. Even if time travel were possible, the grandfather paradox shows that changing the past might lead to contradictions. It suggests that time is more complex than we think, and altering the past could have far-reaching consequences that we can't predict. The paradox isn't just a thought experiment about time travel. It's a way to explore how everything, time, causality, and reality, might be interconnected in ways we don't fully understand. In the end, the grandfather paradox challenges us to rethink our understanding of time, causality, and the possibility of time travel. It raises deep questions about how the past, present, and future are linked. Even as time travel remains a mystery, the paradox encourages us to think more critically about the nature of time and how events unfold. The paradox of the unexpected hanging is a strange and mind-bending puzzle that deals with expectations and logic. In this scenario, a judge tells a condemned prisoner that he will be hanged on one weekday, but the hanging will be a surprise. The prisoner is told that he will not know the day of the hanging until the moment it happens, and that the execution will be a surprise to him. The prisoner, after thinking this through, logically concludes that he will never be hanged. However, in the end, he is hanged on a day when he is completely surprised. At first, this seems impossible. The prisoner reasons that because the hanging will be a surprise, it cannot happen on the last day of the week, Friday, because by the time Thursday ends, he would know the hanging must happen on Friday. So the hanging can't be on Friday. With this reasoning, he eliminates Friday as an option. Next, the prisoner reasons that since Friday is ruled out, the hanging must occur on Thursday. But now, because Thursday is the last possible day, the prisoner thinks that by the time Wednesday ends, he would know the hanging must happen on Thursday. So he rules out Thursday as well. The prisoner continues this logic for each day of the week. He eliminates Wednesday, then Tuesday, and finally Monday. In his mind, he has logically proven that the hanging can't happen on any day, so he believes that he will not be hanged at all. But here's where the paradox kicks in. The prisoner is hanged on a day that surprises him. He is caught off guard because despite all of his reasoning, the hanging happens on an unexpected day. The prisoner's conclusion that the hanging would not happen on any day of the week is flawed, yet it follows a reasonable line of thought. To understand the paradox, we need to examine the way the prisoner's logic works. On the surface, it seems that the prisoner is right. If he has eliminated each day of the week, then it should be impossible for him to be hanged. But the problem lies in the way the prisoner is thinking about the surprise element. He is reasoning backwards, trying to predict when the surprise will occur, and in doing so, he causes the surprise to lose its meaning. By thinking through the logic in this way, the prisoner creates an expectation of the hanging happening at no time. But this expectation is itself the key to the surprise. The fact that the prisoner is convinced that no hanging will happen makes the event even more surprising when it occurs. The prisoner's mistake is in assuming that the surprise element can be fully deduced and eliminated, which creates the very condition that makes the hanging a surprise. Let's break it down further. Imagine a person who is told they will be given a gift, but they won't know when it will happen. The person spends time trying to figure out when they will get the gift, eliminating each possible time based on the idea that it will be a surprise. But in doing so, they miss the point. The surprise happens precisely because they believe it won't. This creates a situation where the surprise is inevitable, despite the reasoning that led the prisoner to believe otherwise. By eliminating each day one by one, the prisoner's thinking leads him directly to the moment of surprise. The paradox plays on the conflict between expectation and surprise, showing that the very act of trying to predict the surprise is what sets it up to happen. Another way to think about this is to consider how the prisoner's reasoning relies on the assumption that he has full control over his knowledge of the future. He assumes that by logically eliminating each day, he can determine when the hanging will or will not happen. But this overlooks the key feature of the surprise. No matter how much reasoning the prisoner does, the act of surprise still depends on something beyond his control. In the end, the paradox shows how our reasoning can sometimes mislead us when we try to predict events based on limited information. The prisoner uses logic to convince himself of something that isn't true, leading to an unexpected outcome. It highlights the tension between what we think we know and what we can't predict, no matter how much we try to analyze the situation. Let's consider a simple example outside of the paradox. Suppose you are told you will receive a phone call, but you won't know when it will come. You might think, I know it won't come at 10 a.m. because I'll be busy. It won't come at noon because I have a meeting. It can't come at 2 p.m. because I'll be in class. After eliminating all the possibilities, you might think the call won't happen at all. But then, the call comes unexpectedly at 3 p.m. and you are surprised. In this scenario, your reasoning mirrors the prisoner's logic. By trying to predict the exact time of the call, you unknowingly set yourself up for the very surprise you thought you avoided. The paradox of the unexpected hanging reveals something important about how we approach knowledge and certainty. We often think that by reasoning through a situation carefully, we can predict the outcome with accuracy. However, in some cases, the very act of predicting can disrupt the situation itself. The prisoner's mistake is in assuming that surprise can be entirely eliminated by logical deduction. The paradox highlights that surprise doesn't depend on having all the facts. It depends on the unexpected nature of an event. This paradox also brings into question our understanding of time, expectation, and control. We usually think of surprises as something that can't be planned for, but the prisoner's reasoning suggests that surprises can be planned or expected. However, the more we try to predict them, the more we set ourselves up to be surprised. This shows how difficult it is to fully control or predict the unknown, no matter how much we try to reason through it. In the end, the paradox of the unexpected hanging challenges our assumptions about surprise, logic, and how we handle uncertainty. The prisoner's conclusion that the hanging cannot happen, based on his reasoning, leads directly to the very surprise that he was trying to avoid. It teaches us that sometimes the more we try to predict the future, the less prepared we are for the unexpected. The Sorites Paradox is a problem that arises when we try to define concepts that don't have clear-cut boundaries. It starts with a simple idea. Suppose you have a heap of sand. You begin removing grains one by one. At what point does it stop being a heap of sand? After removing a certain number of grains, it's no longer a heap. But when does it change from a heap to just a pile of sand, or even to nothing at all? The paradox gets its name from the Greek word soros, meaning heap. It brings attention to how we define things in a world that is not always black and white. The question is tricky because there is no obvious line where a heap of sand stops being a heap. If you remove a single grain, it's still a heap. If you keep removing grains, it's still a heap, but at some point, it seems like it's no longer a heap. But when exactly does that happen? To make it clearer, let's consider an example. Imagine you have a heap of sand, and you remove one grain. It's still a heap, right? Now you remove another grain. Is it still a heap? Probably. You keep removing grains, and after a while, you might feel like it's no longer a heap, but rather just a small pile or maybe even a collection of individual grains. But at what point did it stop being a heap? There's no exact moment you can point to and say, this is when it stopped being a heap. The gradual change from a heap to something else doesn't have a clear boundary. This problem is at the heart of the Sorites Paradox. It forces us to think about how we define vague terms like heap. In everyday life, we use these kinds of terms all the time without thinking about it. We say things like a pile of clothes or a group of people. But when we try to be more precise, the lines between categories start to blur. How many clothes make a pile? How many people make a group? The Sorites Paradox asks whether we can draw clear lines between these concepts, or if they exist on a continuous scale without any distinct boundaries. Let's think of the paradox in another way. Suppose you have a large number of grains of sand, and you begin removing them one by one. After removing just one grain, is it still a heap? Yes, after removing 1,000 grains, is it still a heap? Likely. But at some point, you might look at what's left and feel it's no longer a heap. However, according to the paradox, there's no exact point where the heap transitions to something else. Each time you remove a grain, the difference seems so small that it's hard to say when the heap ceases to be a heap. The paradox is also known as the paradox of the beard. Imagine a man who has a beard. If you remove one hair, is he still bearded? Yes, if you keep removing hairs one by one. At what point is he no longer bearded? It's difficult to say. The problem is that there isn't an obvious line where his beard ends and his clean-shaven face begins. This paradox highlights a broader issue with vague concepts. In philosophy, this is called vagueness. Some terms like heap or beard don't have clear-cut definitions, so it's hard to say exactly when they apply. The Sorites Paradox asks us to consider what happens when we use terms that don't have precise boundaries. One possible solution to the paradox is to accept that certain terms don't need clear boundaries. Instead of trying to draw a line between a heap and non-heap, we could say that there is a range of cases where something is considered a heap, and the meaning of the term changes gradually as we remove grains. This view is known as fuzzy logic, where concepts are understood in terms of degrees, not absolutes. In this view, there is no single point where a heap becomes something else, but rather a gradual transition where the concept of a heap weakens as more grains are removed. Another approach is to argue that we should draw arbitrary lines to distinguish between a heap and a non-heap. In this view, we accept that our concepts are not perfect, but we create practical definitions for everyday use. We might say that a heap must contain at least 100 grains of sand, and once the number falls below that, it is no longer a heap. While this solution is not perfect, it helps us create a functional distinction between heaps and non-heaps for practical purposes. Some philosophers argue that the Sorites Paradox shows that our language and categories are inherently flawed. The paradox forces us to acknowledge that there are many concepts that we use without thinking about their precise boundaries. In this view, the problem of the heap is just one example of a larger issue in how we use language to describe the world. We rely on categories like heap or group because they are useful, but the lack of precise boundaries shows the limits of our language. Some believe that we can solve the paradox by looking at it from a different perspective. Instead of trying to draw a line between a heap and a non-heap, we could consider the context in which the term heap is used. In some situations, a small pile of sand might be considered a heap, while in other situations, a much larger pile might be needed. The meaning of heap could change depending on the context, and the boundaries of the term could shift as a result. The Sorites Paradox raises important questions about how we think and communicate. It challenges us to think critically about the terms we use and whether they are always as clear-cut as we believe. While there may not be a simple solution to the paradox, it encourages us to recognize the complexity of language and the challenges of defining concepts that don't have precise boundaries. In everyday life, we continue to use vague terms like heap without thinking too much about it. However, the Sorites Paradox forces us to confront the challenges that arise when we try to create precise definitions for concepts that are inherently vague. It's a reminder that language is a tool we use to navigate the world, but it doesn't always capture the complexities of reality in a neat and tidy way. Hempel's paradox, also known as the paradox of the ravens, presents a challenge to how we think about evidence and confirmation. It starts with a simple hypothesis: all ravens are black. If this is true, then when you observe a black raven, it seems like you're confirming the hypothesis. After all, you're seeing something that matches what you expect. But then, the paradox takes an unexpected turn. It turns out that even observing a green apple seems to confirm the hypothesis that all ravens are black. But how can this be? There's no logical connection between the color of an apple and the color of ravens. How does a green apple confirm anything about ravens? To understand the paradox, let's break it down. You start with the hypothesis, all ravens are black. This is a general statement about all ravens. According to Hempel's reasoning, every time you see a black raven, you're collecting evidence that supports the hypothesis. Each black raven you observe fits the description and seems to confirm the claim that all ravens are black. Now, let's add another layer. In logic, the statement all ravens are black is equivalent to saying, if something is a raven, then it is black. This is called the contrapositive of the statement. The contrapositive is a logical equivalence, meaning that if all ravens are black is true, then the statement, if something is not black, it is not a raven, must also be true. So, when you observe a green apple, it's not black, and therefore, it is not a raven. In other words, the green apple is an example of something that supports the contrapositive. If something is not black, it is not a raven. At first, this doesn't seem to make sense. How can a green apple, which is completely unrelated to ravens, confirm the hypothesis that all ravens are black? The key here is understanding that in terms of formal logic, observing a non-black object, like a green apple, fits the contrapositive of the hypothesis. Since the apple is not black, it's evidence that it is not a raven. In a way, it confirms the idea that the only things that are black are ravens, supporting the hypothesis indirectly. This creates a paradox, because in our everyday thinking, we don't usually consider green apples or other unrelated things as evidence for the color of ravens. We would naturally think that only observing a raven directly, especially a black one, would provide meaningful evidence for the hypothesis. But the logic of the paradox forces us to admit that in a strict formal sense, a green apple can be seen as evidence for the hypothesis that all ravens are black. To make this clearer, let's consider another example. Suppose someone makes a claim about a group of people, such as all the people in this room are wearing red shirts. If you observe a person in the room wearing a red shirt, That fits the claim and confirms it. But if you observe a person who isn't in the room at all, wearing a red shirt, it still seems to support the claim, even though this person is completely unrelated to the group in the room. This feels odd because the irrelevant person's shirt color has no bearing on the original group. Yet, under the rules of formal logic, the irrelevant observation is still seen as evidence confirming the claim. Hempel's paradox challenges the way we think about what constitutes meaningful evidence. In everyday life, we typically rely on direct observations to confirm hypotheses. If you want to test whether all ravens are black, you go out and observe ravens. Each time you see a black raven, you feel like you're adding a bit of support to the claim. But according to the paradox, you also confirm the hypothesis every time you see something that is not black and also not a raven. This can feel counterintuitive because it goes against how we normally interpret evidence. The paradox also highlights a problem with how we handle large generalizations. When we make a broad claim, like all ravens are black, we are making a statement about every raven, no matter where it is or how many of them exist. The more specific and direct our evidence seems, the more comfortable we feel in confirming the hypothesis. However, Hempel's paradox reminds us that in formal logic, every piece of evidence, even something as seemingly irrelevant as a green apple, can play a role in confirming a hypothesis. This forces us to rethink how we interpret evidence and what kinds of observations are actually meaningful. Let's take the example of a scientist studying a new species of bird. The scientist hypothesizes all members of this species have blue feathers. If the scientist observes a bird from the species and sees that it has blue feathers, this observation strengthens the hypothesis. But if the scientist then sees a red flower, according to the logic of the paradox, this also adds support to the hypothesis, even though there's no connection between flowers and the bird species. The observation feels irrelevant, yet according to formal logic, it contributes to the confirmation of the hypothesis. This brings up the question of how to deal with confirmation in the real world. Should we accept every observation that fits the formal rules of logic, even when it seems disconnected from the hypothesis we are testing? Or should we limit ourselves to more direct evidence, like observing a black raven, and ignore the seemingly irrelevant examples, like a green apple or a red flower? The paradox suggests that our intuitions about evidence and confirmation can sometimes be at odds with formal logic. Hempel's paradox also ties into the problem of how we test hypotheses in science and everyday life. In practice, scientists would likely never consider a green apple or a red flower as evidence for the color of ravens, because it's not a meaningful or relevant observation. The paradox exposes the tension between formal logical reasoning and the practical, intuitive way we gather and evaluate evidence. While the green apple confirms the hypothesis in a formal sense, it does so in a way that seems counterproductive or nonsensical in the context of the original hypothesis. In the end, the paradox of the ravens challenges us to think more carefully about how we reason and what counts as evidence. While formal logic might allow seemingly unrelated things to confirm a hypothesis, our everyday understanding of evidence suggests we should focus on direct, relevant observations. The paradox forces us to confront the limits of logical reasoning and consider how much weight we should give to indirect or irrelevant evidence when forming conclusions. The Omnipotence Paradox is a famous puzzle that questions the nature of omnipotence or all-powerfulness. The paradox asks, can an omnipotent being create a rock so heavy that even it cannot lift? On the surface, the question seems straightforward, but it quickly leads to a logical contradiction. If the being can create such a rock, then it seems that it isn't omnipotent, because there is something it cannot do: lift the rock. But if the being cannot create the rock in the first place, then it seems that it is also not omnipotent, because there is something it cannot do: create the rock. The paradox forces us to think deeply about the concept of omnipotence and what it really means for something to be all-powerful. Let's break it down. Omnipotence is generally defined as the ability to do anything, no matter how difficult or impossible it might seem. The idea is that an omnipotent being should have no limits. It should be able to perform any action, no matter how impossible it might appear to us. But the question of the rock forces us to ask, does omnipotence mean the ability to do literally anything, including things that are logically contradictory? If we say that an omnipotent being can create a rock so heavy that even it cannot lift it, then we run into a problem. The being's power is now limited by its own creation because it cannot lift the rock. This seems to contradict the idea of omnipotence, which is supposed to mean having no limits. The being's inability to lift the rock means it is not truly omnipotent, according to this reasoning. But then, if the being cannot create such a rock in the first place, it also seems to be lacking power, because there is something it cannot do, create the rock. On the other hand, if we say that an omnipotent being cannot create the rock, we run into the same issue. The very idea of omnipotence suggests that the being can do anything, and creating a rock, no matter how heavy, shouldn't be outside its abilities. So, if the being cannot create the rock, it appears that it is not truly all-powerful. This seems to be a contradiction, because according to the definition of omnipotence, there should be no action that is beyond its reach. The paradox leads us to question what we mean when we talk about omnipotence. Is it really the ability to do anything, including things that seem logically impossible, or is omnipotence limited by the nature of logic itself? Some argue that omnipotence should be understood as the ability to do anything that is logically possible. In this view, the inability to create a rock so heavy that even the omnipotent being cannot lift it is not a limitation of power, but a result of the very nature of logic. In other words, the question itself is meaningless because it asks about a logical contradiction. It would be like asking if an omnipotent being can make a square circle. The idea of a square circle doesn't make sense, and therefore it doesn't make sense to say that an omnipotent being could create one. Others suggest that omnipotence doesn't include the power to do things that are logically contradictory because such things do not exist in the realm of possibility. This view argues that the paradox is not a problem for omnipotence because the question itself is flawed. Omnipotence, in this sense, means having the ability to do anything that is logically possible, but not the ability to do things that are logically incoherent. The Omnipotence Paradox also forces us to consider the nature of power itself. What does it mean to be all-powerful? If an omnipotent being can do anything, does that include things that are self-contradictory or meaningless? Is the power to perform illogical actions truly part of being omnipotent, or is it something else? For many, the idea of omnipotence is not about the ability to do the impossible, but the ability to do anything that can be done within the rules of logic and reality. In this view, the paradox does not pose a real challenge to the concept of omnipotence, but simply highlights the limits of what we can logically conceive of as being possible. An example that might help clarify the situation is the idea of a person who is very strong. If someone is incredibly strong, they might be able to lift heavy objects, but there will still be a limit to how much weight they can lift. This limitation is not because they are not strong, but because of the physical laws of the world. Similarly, some argue that omnipotence is like this kind of strength. It's not about being able to do literally anything, but about being able to do anything that is logically possible. Just as a strong person can't lift a weight that exceeds the limits of physics, an omnipotent being cannot do things that are logically impossible, like creating a rock it cannot lift. Another way to think about the paradox is to look at it from the perspective of language. The question, can an omnipotent being create a rock so heavy that even it cannot lift, is framed in a way that mixes concepts in a way that is not meaningful. The question tries to combine the concepts of omnipotence and self-contradiction, which leads to confusion. Some philosophers argue that the question itself is simply incoherent because it asks about an impossible situation. Just as we can't meaningfully talk about a square circle, we can't meaningfully talk about a rock that an omnipotent being cannot lift because it's a concept that doesn't make sense. The Omnipotence Paradox ultimately raises important questions about the limits of power and the nature of logical possibility. It challenges our understanding of omnipotence and asks us to think more carefully about what it means to be all-powerful. Does being omnipotent mean having the power to do anything, even things that are logically impossible? Or does it mean having the power to do anything that can be done within the constraints of logic and reality? The paradox forces us to confront the limits of our own thinking about power and to reconsider what we really mean when we talk about the nature of omnipotence. Newcomb's paradox is a thought experiment that challenges how we make decisions when faced with uncertainty. In the game, you have two boxes to choose from. One box contains $1,000 for sure, and the other box may contain $1 million, but only if a predictor correctly predicts your choice. If the predictor foresees that you will choose only the $1 million box, it places the $1 million inside that box. If the predictor believes you will choose both boxes, then the $1 million box remains empty, and only the $1,000 box contains money. The paradox centers on a dilemma. Should you take both boxes, or just the $1 million box? On the surface, the choice seems easy. If you take both boxes, you will get $1,000 no matter what, and you might also get the $1 million if the predictor was wrong. If you take only the $1 million box, you could end up with nothing if the predictor thought you would take both boxes. But this raises the key question. Does it make sense to trust the prediction, or should you always take both boxes to maximize your guaranteed money? At first glance, the most logical approach seems to be to take both boxes. If the $1 million box is empty, you still get $1,000. If the $1 million box is full, you get $1,000 plus the million. So, it seems like taking both boxes is a safer bet. It guarantees you at least $1,000 with the potential to get $1 million. This is known as the dominance argument in decision theory. It suggests that no matter what the predictor has done, choosing both boxes gives you more money. But here's where the paradox deepens. The game involves a predictor who has been right in the past 99% of the time. The predictor has observed your behavior, and based on that, they make an accurate prediction about whether you'll choose one box or both. If the predictor predicts that you will choose both boxes, they leave the $1 million box empty, making your choice of both boxes result in only $1,000. If the predictor predicts that you will choose only the $1 million box, they fill that box with $1 million. Now, if you believe the predictor is very reliable, it seems like the better choice would be to just take the $1 million box. If the predictor expects you to choose only one box, then they will put the $1 million in it, and you'll walk away with $1 million. Choosing both boxes, on the other hand, seems to go against the predictor's foreseen choice, which would leave the $1 million box empty. So there are two competing ways of thinking about the situation. One that says you should take both boxes, based on the idea that it's always better to maximize your money, and another that suggests you should trust the predictor's ability and take only the $1 million box. Each approach is backed by sound reasoning, yet they lead to different decisions. If you're focused on immediate gain, the argument for taking both boxes makes sense. You know that you're getting $1,000 for sure, and there's a possibility of getting $1 million. But if you place trust in the predictor's ability to foresee your behavior, it seems more reasonable to just take the $1 million box. After all, if the predictor has been right 99% of the time, they're likely to predict your choice accurately and give you the million. This creates a conflict. If you follow the logic of maximizing your guaranteed outcome, you will take both boxes. However, if you trust the predictor's judgment and assume that they know you well enough to predict your behavior accurately, you will only take the one box. This tension between certainty and prediction is the core of Newcomb's paradox. One way to approach this is to consider how you might act in real-life situations where predictions play a role. If you know that someone has a 99% chance of being correct about your future actions, you might decide to go along with their prediction. It's like a teacher who knows that you will turn in an assignment on time. If you trust that they know you well enough, you might act according to their prediction rather than risk defying it. The predictor in Newcomb's paradox works similarly. They're not just guessing, they have a high track record of being right. So you might choose to act in a way that aligns with their prediction. But on the other hand, the dominance argument suggests that your decision should not depend on the prediction, especially if you value certainty. By choosing both boxes, you're always guaranteed to walk away with at least $1,000, which is an amount you know you'll get. In this view, the prediction does not change the fact that you could potentially leave with both a smaller guaranteed amount and a larger bonus. Why leave the $1,000 behind just to trust a prediction? Let's imagine a simpler scenario. Suppose you're told that you can either take a sure $100 or roll a die, and if the die lands on 6, you'll win $1,000, but if it doesn't, you win nothing. If you follow the logic of risk, it might seem smart to take the $100 for certain, rather than risk getting nothing. But if you had more information, say the die was weighted to land on 6 nearly every time, you might feel confident enough to roll the die, trusting that you would most likely win the $1,000. The same concept applies in Newcomb's paradox, where you must balance the potential reward of trusting the prediction with the certainty of taking both boxes. Ultimately, Newcomb's paradox challenges us to think about how we handle choices involving uncertainty and trust. Should we rely on the logic of maximizing our guaranteed rewards, or should we trust predictions based on past behavior, especially when those predictions are highly reliable? There's no clear-cut answer, as both choices have valid arguments behind them. The paradox forces us to consider how we make decisions in situations where logic, trust, and risk all come into play. And in the end, whether you take both boxes or just one may depend on how much faith you place in the predictor's ability to foresee your actions. The paradox of free will is one of the most enduring puzzles in philosophy. It questions whether we truly have the freedom to make our own choices if the future is determined by the laws of nature. The idea is that if everything that happens is a result of previous events and natural laws, then every decision we make, every action we take, must also be predetermined. But we also experience life as if we are free to choose, to make decisions that shape our future. This creates a tension. How can we feel like we have free will if the future is already set? Imagine you wake up in the morning and decide what to eat for breakfast. You might choose cereal, toast, or something else. As you make this decision, it feels like a free choice. But if you think about it more deeply, you might wonder, is this choice truly free, or was it shaped by everything that led up to it? Your preference for cereal might be influenced by your upbringing, your current mood, or even the availability of cereal in your kitchen. In this sense, it might seem like your decision was influenced by forces outside of your control, such as past experiences and external factors. If the future is predetermined, it seems like every choice you make would also be predetermined by these factors. The laws of nature, along with all the events that have happened up until now, would have set you on a path where you will make certain decisions. In this view, your decision to have cereal might have been decided long before you even woke up, because the chain of events leading to that decision was set in motion by everything that came before it. But on the other hand, when we think about our everyday experience, we feel like we have the ability to choose freely. You could have had toast instead of cereal, or you could have gone out to a cafe instead of eating at home. You might make decisions based on your own preferences or reasons, and you can change your mind. This feeling of freedom, of being able to make choices, seems to contradict the idea that everything is predetermined. If the future is already set, how can we feel like we have control over our decisions? Let's look at a different scenario to explore this idea further. Imagine a person who's deciding whether or not to take a job offer. On the surface, it feels like a free decision. The person weighs the pros and cons, salary, location, work-life balance, and other factors. But if we believe that everything in the universe, including human decisions, follows natural laws, then the person's decision might not be as free as it seems. The decision could be the result of past experiences, genetic influences, and the current state of the world. Perhaps the person was raised to value financial security, or they had a conversation the previous day that made them lean toward accepting the job. In this case, the feeling of freedom might be an illusion. This tension between the feeling of free will and the idea of a predetermined future is at the heart of the paradox. If we accept that the laws of nature govern everything, it seems like the future is set, and our actions are simply the result of those laws. Yet, our experience tells us something different. We make decisions, we change our minds, and we feel like we're shaping our own future. So how do we reconcile this contradiction? One way to approach the paradox is to consider the idea of compatibilism. This is the view that free will and determinism can coexist. According to compatibilists, even if the future is determined by the laws of nature, we can still have free will as long as we can act in ways that are consistent with our desires and reasoning. Free will doesn't mean the ability to choose independently of all influences. It means being able to act according to our own motivations, without external coercion. So, while our decisions might be influenced by our past experiences and the natural laws that govern the universe, we still have the freedom to act on our own reasons and preferences. To illustrate this, let's return to the person choosing a job. Even if their decision is shaped by factors like their upbringing or the advice of friends, they still make the choice themselves. They may have a genuine preference for one job over another, and they make the decision based on what feels right to them. In the compatibilist view, this is still free will because the person is acting in accordance with their own desires and reasoning, even though those desires are shaped by their past experiences and the laws of nature. Another perspective is the libertarian view of free will, which argues that humans have the ability to make truly free choices that are not determined by prior events or the laws of nature. According to this view, the future is not entirely set, and we have the capacity to make decisions that are not merely the result of past causes. In this view, when the person decides whether to take the job, they have the power to make a decision that is not fully determined by their past experiences, environment, or biology. Their choice is genuinely free, and they have the ability to make a decision independent of any prior cause. However, this view faces challenges. If we have true free will, it's unclear how our decisions could be made without being influenced by past experiences, our biology, or the world around us. How could we make a choice without any influences at all? It seems like everything we do is influenced by something. Even if we feel free to make choices, it's difficult to say how those choices could be truly independent of everything else. The paradox also brings up the question of moral responsibility. If our actions are determined by the laws of nature, how can we be held responsible for them? If you were destined to make a certain decision, can you truly be blamed or praised for it? This is a key issue in the debate over free will and determinism. If we are not truly free to choose, can we still be morally accountable for our actions? At the same time, our everyday experience suggests that we do have control over our choices. We make decisions all the time based on what we value, what we desire, and what we believe. It feels like we are responsible for those decisions, even if they are influenced by factors outside our control. The feeling of freedom in decision-making is real, and it shapes how we live our lives. We plan, we choose, and we act, and we generally believe we have the power to change our future by making different choices. The paradox of free will doesn't offer an easy solution, but it forces us to confront the complexity of how we experience freedom and how the world works. If the future is predetermined, can we still be free? Or is our sense of freedom just an illusion? Whether we believe in compatibilism, libertarian free will, or determinism, the paradox remains a powerful reminder that our understanding of free will and choice is not as simple as it seems. The grandfather paradox is a famous thought experiment that explores the strange implications of time travel. In this paradox, a person travels back in time and accidentally kills their grandfather before their parent is conceived. If the grandfather dies, then the time traveler's parent is never born. And since the time traveler's existence depends on their parent being born, the time traveler cannot exist. But if the time traveler does not exist, how could they have traveled back in time in the first place? This creates a logical loop that seems impossible to resolve. Let's break it down with a simple scenario. Imagine you are the time traveler. You are born, live your life, and then discover the ability to travel back in time. Excited, you go back to a time before your parent was born, and through some accident or miscalculation, you kill your grandfather. Your grandfather's death means that your parent is never conceived, and therefore, you were never born. But if you were never born, how could you have traveled back in time to kill your grandfather? It's a paradox because the very act of killing your grandfather prevents your own existence. But your existence is necessary to travel back and make that act happen. This paradox raises important questions about how time works. If time travel is possible, how can we ensure that changes to the past do not erase the very conditions that allow those changes to happen in the first place? The situation feels like a contradiction because it suggests that actions in the past can undo the future. But in doing so, they would prevent themselves from happening in the first place. One way to think about this is through the lens of causality, the idea that one event leads to another. Normally, we understand that events follow one another in a predictable order. If you wake up in the morning and decide to eat breakfast, you will eat it, and that decision leads to the next set of actions in your day. But when we introduce time travel, the cause and effect chain becomes unclear. If you go back and alter an event that is part of your past, like killing your grandfather, you disrupt the chain of events that led to your own birth. Without you being born, there is no reason for you to have traveled back in time. The paradox shows how time travel could break the usual rules of cause and effect. The grandfather paradox also introduces the issue of determinism. If the past is fixed and cannot be changed, then it seems like events must unfold in a way that allows time travelers to exist and act in the past. In this view, the time traveler's actions would have to fit into the established timeline, and killing the grandfather would somehow be impossible because the time traveler cannot alter events that lead to their own existence. This is one possible way of thinking about time, as something that is determined and unchangeable, no matter how much you might want to change it. Another possible solution is the idea of multiple timelines. In this view, when you travel back in time and change something, like killing your grandfather, you create a new timeline or parallel universe. In the new timeline, your grandfather is dead and your parent is never born. But in the original timeline, where you came from, you still exist and nothing has changed. The act of killing your grandfather creates a separate branch of reality where you no longer exist, but the timeline you came from remains unchanged. This would allow time travel to be possible without creating a logical contradiction, because the past has changed only in a new reality, while the original timeline continues as before. While multiple timelines offer a way to escape the paradox, this view comes with its own complications. If new timelines can be created every time a change is made, It raises the question of how many timelines would exist and how they would interact with one another. It also suggests that actions in the past can have far-reaching consequences that might not be easy to control. If every change creates a new timeline, the number of possible realities could grow exponentially, leading to a situation where it's impossible to track or understand the true course of events. Another possible resolution to the grandfather paradox is the idea that time travel simply isn't possible. If we accept that the past, present, and future are all fixed and cannot be changed, then the idea of going back and altering the past becomes a contradiction in itself. If time travel were possible, something would prevent the time traveler from killing their grandfather, like an inherent limit to what can be done to the past. This view suggests that while time travel might be an interesting thought experiment, it may never be possible because it creates more problems than it solves. It's like trying to break a law of nature that doesn't allow such contradictions. The grandfather paradox forces us to reconsider the nature of time and causality. If time travel were possible, could we truly change the past? Or would the past remain fixed no matter what we tried to do? The paradox suggests that the future might depend on the past in ways we don't fully understand. If one event in the past changes, it could have ripple effects on everything that follows. In the case of the grandfather paradox, the time traveler's actions disrupt the very event that would allow them to exist, which creates a conflict between the desire to change the past and the reality of a fixed timeline. Think of a simpler scenario that illustrates the same issue. Imagine a person who is trying to make a change in their life, like moving to a new city. They make the decision, pack their things, and set off on the journey. But as they travel, they experience a series of unexpected events that force them to turn back. It's not the same situation as the grandfather paradox, but it illustrates how decisions and actions can lead to unintended consequences that affect what happens next. The problem with time travel, as shown in the paradox, is that one action in the past could completely erase the chain of events that led to it, creating a loop of contradictions. Ultimately, the grandfather paradox raises important questions about the limits of our understanding of time, causality, and the nature of reality. If we could travel back in time, would we truly have the power to change the past? Or would our actions simply be part of a fixed timeline? Whether we see the paradox as a flaw in our understanding of time, or as a way to show the impossibility of time travel, it challenges us to think about the complex relationships between past, present, and future, and the consequences of our actions within that framework. The Monty Hall problem is a probability puzzle based on a game show. In the game, you pick one of 3 doors. Behind one of them is a car, and behind the other 2 are goats. Once you choose a door, the host, Monty Hall, who knows what's behind each door, opens one of the other 2 doors to reveal a goat. You are then given the option to stick with your original choice or switch to the remaining unopened door. The question is, should you switch? Statistically, the best move is to switch your choice, as doing so increases your chances of winning. Let's break this down with a simple example. You pick a door. At this point, you have a 1 in 3 chance of choosing the car and a 2 in 3 chance of choosing a goat. Once you've made your initial pick, Monty will open one of the other 2 doors, revealing a goat. Importantly, Monty will always reveal a goat, as he knows where the car is. So this step doesn't provide any new random information about the location of the car. What it does do is change the odds in a way that may seem counterintuitive at first. At the moment Monty reveals a goat behind one of the other doors, you might think the odds are now 50-50 between the 2 remaining doors. However, the truth is that your initial choice still has only a 1 in 3 chance of being correct. This is where the Monty Hall problem gets tricky. The probability that the car is behind one of the other 2 doors was originally 2 in 3. Since Monty has already shown you one of those doors contains a goat, that entire 2 in 3 chance shifts to the remaining unopened door. In other words, the unopened door now has a 2 in 3 chance of having the car, while your original choice still only has a 1 in 3 chance of being correct. Let's walk through a few scenarios to make this clearer. Suppose you pick door 1. There are 3 possibilities. The car is behind door 1, your original choice. The car is behind door 2. The car is behind door 3. If the car is behind door 1, Monty can open either door 2 or door 3 to reveal a goat. If the car is behind door 2, Monty will open door 3 to show a goat. If the car is behind door 3, Monty will open door 2 to show a goat. In every case, after Monty opens a door, switching will give you a better chance of winning. If you stick with door 1, you only win if you initially picked the car, which happens 1 out of 3 times. But if you switch, you win whenever you didn't pick the car initially, which happens 2 out of 3 times. Here's another way to think about it. Imagine a simplified version of the problem where Monty has a deck of cards. He shuffles it and places 3 cards face down, one of which is a winning card. You pick a card, and then Monty turns over one of the remaining cards to show it's not the winning card. He asks if you want to stick with your choice or switch to the other card. The odds of switching being a better strategy still hold, and the reasoning is the same as with the doors. By revealing a losing card, Monty has essentially told you that the chances of the winning card being in the remaining 2 spots are higher than the chance that it's behind your initial pick. This result might seem odd at first because the situation seems like it should be a 50-50 choice once Monty reveals a goat. But the key insight is that Monty's action, revealing a goat, changes the probabilities. You started with a 1 in 3 chance of picking the car, but once Monty eliminates a losing option, the probability of the car being behind the other door becomes 2 in 3. This shift happens because Monty's behavior isn't random. He always reveals a goat, which influences the odds. A common intuition might be to think that once one of the doors is eliminated, the odds should reset to 50-50. However, the initial conditions matter. When you made your first choice, there was a 2 in 3 chance you picked a goat. By showing you a goat behind one of the other doors, Monty has effectively given you a second chance to take advantage of those 2 in 3 odds. To further explain, let's use a simple analogy. Imagine you're playing a game where you pick a marble from one of 3 jars. 2 jars have blue marbles, and 1 has a red marble. You pick one jar, and then the game host opens one of the jars that contains a blue marble. You are then given the chance to switch your choice to the other unopened jar. Statistically, switching gives you a 2 in 3 chance of picking the red marble, while sticking with your original choice gives you only a 1 in 3 chance. This analogy works because it mirrors the same logic at play in the Monty Hall problem. In both cases, the host's action of revealing information about one of the losing options increases the odds of winning if you switch. Even if you feel like the remaining options should be equally likely, the host's action changes the odds by providing information about the game. You now know that the odds of your initial choice being right are low, and the odds of the other option being right are much higher. The Monty Hall problem is a great example of how intuition can be misleading when it comes to probability. Many people initially believe that after one of the doors is opened, the game is down to a 50-50 choice. But this is incorrect. Understanding why switching doors increases your chances requires thinking through the logic behind probability and how new information can shift the odds. It's important to remember that this strategy applies only when the host's actions are known and predictable. If Monty didn't know where the car was, or if he could open a door randomly, the situation would be different. But because Monty always reveals a goat, the situation is set up so that switching is the best choice. In real life, we might face situations where we are given multiple options and need to make decisions based on incomplete information. While the Monty Hall problem is a simplified game, it serves as a reminder that sometimes what seems like a 50-50 choice might actually have a better solution if we understand the probabilities at play. It teaches us to question our assumptions and look at decisions from a more strategic, calculated perspective. The paradox of the unexpected result highlights an interesting and counterintuitive idea. Even when we think we have every possible outcome figured out, something completely unexpected can still happen. It seems strange, but it happens in life all the time. The paradox challenges our understanding of prediction and the limits of our ability to foresee events, even when we have all the necessary information. Imagine you're participating in a game where the goal is to predict the outcome of a coin flip. You're given all the details about how the coin is flipped, how many times it will land heads or tails, and the precise way it's tossed. You know exactly how the coin will be flipped, and you even know how many heads and tails should appear. You might expect a 50-50 outcome, but then the result turns out to be completely different from what anyone could predict. Maybe the coin lands on its edge, something no one expected. The paradox is that despite all the details, the result is still surprising. This paradox shows that even with all the information we could possibly have, the outcome can defy expectations. The paradox doesn't just apply to games or simple events. Think about a scenario in life where you've planned everything meticulously. Suppose you're about to launch a new product. You've conducted market research, analyzed customer behavior, and created a strategy based on data. All signs point to success, yet when the product is released, the response is completely different from what you anticipated. The product may fail to catch on, or perhaps it becomes an unexpected hit in a completely different market. Even though you've accounted for every possible outcome, the result surprises you. The paradox of the unexpected result shows us that even the most carefully considered predictions can sometimes be off the mark. This paradox can also apply to something as simple as waiting for a surprise. Imagine you're told that you will receive a surprise gift, but the surprise is that you will receive a surprise gift at a certain time. You know that it will be a surprise, but because you're expecting it to be a surprise, you're still anticipating it in some way. In this case, the surprise is in the expectation itself. Even though you anticipate it, the surprise still manages to catch you off guard. The key to this paradox is in the way we approach prediction. In theory, the more information we have, the better our ability to predict outcomes. If we know all the variables involved, we should be able to anticipate what will happen next. However, the paradox reveals that there are limits to our ability to predict. Despite all the facts, there can still be an unexpected result that no one saw coming. The surprise doesn't come from a lack of information, but from the limitations of our understanding. This paradox is not just about randomness or chance. It's about how we process and interpret information. We rely on patterns to make predictions, but those patterns don't always hold up in real life. For example, think about a car accident. After analyzing traffic patterns, weather conditions, and the behavior of the drivers involved, you might predict that an accident is unlikely to occur. But then, out of nowhere, a completely unexpected event happens. A pedestrian runs across the street at the exact wrong moment, leading to an accident. Even though all the information pointed to safety, the result was still unpredictable. The unexpected result is not a flaw in the prediction process, but a reminder that not everything can be foreseen. In the world of science and technology, the paradox can be seen in situations where experiments yield results that no one anticipated. A famous example is the discovery of penicillin. Alexander Fleming was studying bacteria when he noticed that a mold growing in one of his petri dishes was killing the surrounding bacteria. This result was completely unexpected, and it led to one of the most important medical discoveries in history. Despite all the information he had about bacteria and mold, the outcome was a surprise. This wasn't due to a lack of understanding, but rather because certain results are simply not predictable based on existing knowledge. Similarly, in financial markets, analysts use data, trends, and sophisticated models to predict stock prices. Yet, despite the complex systems in place, stock prices often behave in ways that are entirely unexpected. The market can be influenced by factors that no model could predict, such as a sudden shift in political climate or an unforeseen technological breakthrough. The paradox lies in the fact that even with all the information, the unexpected can still happen. The paradox of the unexpected result can also be seen in personal experiences. Think of a time when you've made a decision based on a lot of careful thinking. You plan for all the possibilities, but something still goes wrong. You may have taken every precaution, but something outside of your control interfered, leading to an outcome you didn't foresee. For example, someone might spend years planning for a career change. They do research, network, and position themselves perfectly for a new job, only for a completely unexpected event, like an economic downturn, to change their prospects. In this case, the paradox is clear. Despite all the preparation and effort, the outcome was still surprising. This paradox highlights an important lesson about prediction. The more we anticipate something, the more we might set ourselves up for surprise. We often think that knowing every detail will allow us to predict with certainty, but in many cases, it's the very act of overthinking and expecting something to happen that leads to the most unexpected outcomes. Even when we think we've prepared for every possible scenario, life often has a way of throwing in an element we didn't consider. The paradox of the unexpected result can be unsettling, as it challenges our belief in our ability to control or predict the future. It reminds us that despite our best efforts, the world is full of surprises. We can try to anticipate everything, but the very nature of the future makes it impossible to foresee every detail. This paradox doesn't deny the importance of planning or preparation, but it encourages humility and flexibility when facing the unknown. By acknowledging that the unexpected can still happen, we can approach our predictions with a sense of openness and adaptability, ready for whatever comes next. The paradox of triviality describes a situation where experts overcomplicate a simple issue to the point that the most obvious solution is overlooked. This paradox occurs when people become so wrapped up in complex analysis and technical details that they miss the simplest and most effective answer. The problem lies in focusing too much on minor aspects of an issue and neglecting the bigger picture. Imagine a company that needs to solve a basic problem. Its employees are often late to work because of traffic. Instead of addressing the obvious solution, perhaps offering flexible work hours or providing carpool options, the management hires a team of consultants to study the issue. These consultants spend months analyzing traffic patterns, studying employee productivity, and researching different city transportation policies. They eventually recommend a complex set of changes, like a shuttle service that only runs on specific routes at certain times. Meanwhile, the employees are still late, and the issue hasn't been addressed in a practical way. The paradox here is that the problem, employees being late, could have been solved in a much simpler way. Instead of adding layers of complexity, a straightforward solution might have worked better. By focusing on the wrong details, the experts failed to see the obvious solution that would have had a more immediate and effective impact. This happens often in many areas of life, from business to politics to personal decision-making. It's easy to get caught up in complexity and forget that sometimes the simplest answer is the best one. When experts focus too much on analysis, they can lose sight of the core issue. For example, in a business setting, an organization might have problems with low employee morale. Instead of addressing the problem directly by improving work conditions or offering better incentives, management might turn to studies on workplace psychology, run endless surveys, and hire external consultants to analyze workplace dynamics. All of this complexity might result in small tweaks that don't make much of a difference, while the fundamental issue, the need for better working conditions, goes unaddressed. Another example can be found in the world of technology. Suppose a tech company is developing a new software program, and its main issue is that it keeps crashing for users. Instead of focusing on the primary technical issue, perhaps a bug in the system, the engineers dive into optimizing every minor feature and making the user interface more complex. While these changes may improve some aspects of the software, the main problem still remains. The software keeps crashing. The more they focus on small, detailed improvements, the more they complicate the system, and the simpler issue goes unresolved. The paradox of triviality also appears in everyday situations. Consider a family planning a vacation. Instead of focusing on the basics, like choosing a destination, setting a budget, and booking flights, family members start debating over trivial details. Should they rent a house or a hotel? Should they get a rental car or use public transportation? Should they pack more clothes for different activities? All these small decisions, though important, become the focal point of the planning process, and before long, the vacation is delayed because the family is too wrapped up in the minutiae. The focus on small, trivial details delays the decision-making process, and the larger, more important elements get overlooked. The paradox also shows up in politics, where politicians sometimes spend too much time on complex solutions for problems that have simple answers. For example, a city might face high levels of homelessness. Instead of implementing straightforward solutions like increasing affordable housing or providing better social services, politicians might propose a range of complicated plans that include new regulations, task forces, and bureaucracy. These efforts can be so complex and time-consuming that the actual problem isn't solved, and the homeless population continues to grow. The paradox of triviality often results from a belief that the more complex something is, the better the solution. People assume that expertise and analysis will automatically lead to better results. Even when the answer is clear, experts, consultants, and specialists may feel the need to show their value by offering elaborate solutions, but these solutions can sometimes be far removed from the problem itself. In fact, overcomplicating an issue can sometimes make it worse, as resources are wasted on unnecessary complexity, leaving the simple solution unexplored or ignored. This paradox is also related to the concept of paralysis by analysis. When people overthink problems, they can become overwhelmed by the possibilities and unable to make a decision at all. The more they analyze, the harder it becomes to see the obvious course of action. In the case of the business with late employees, for example, the more the consultants dug into traffic patterns and employee productivity, the less likely they were to suggest the simple solution of adjusting work hours. By focusing too much on the small details, they missed the obvious fix. It's easy to fall into the trap of overcomplicating things, especially in a world where we have access to vast amounts of information. In some cases, experts can get caught up in their own knowledge, thinking that the more they can analyze and solve, the more they can contribute to the solution. But this can lead to inefficiency, with the problem remaining unresolved or even growing worse. By overthinking, the complexity of the problem can be blown out of proportion, and the solution that would have been the easiest and most effective is lost in the noise. One way to avoid the paradox of triviality is to remember that simplicity often leads to the best results. When faced with a problem, it's important to start with the basics. What is the core issue? What is the most straightforward solution? By focusing on the simplest aspects of the problem first, we can often find a clear path forward. Overcomplicating the issue can distract us from the real solution and create unnecessary barriers to progress. The paradox of triviality serves as a reminder to avoid getting lost in unnecessary complexity. Sometimes, the best solution is the simplest one. It's easy to— The paradox of triviality describes a situation where experts overcomplicate a simple issue to the point that the most obvious solution is overlooked. This paradox occurs when people become so wrapped up in complex analysis and technical— The paradox of self-reference is a fascinating and puzzling concept that arises when a statement refers to itself in a way that creates a contradiction. A classic example is the sentence, "This sentence is false." The paradox comes from trying to figure out whether the sentence is true or false. If it's true, then it must be false, as it says it is. But if it's false, then it must be true, because it's claiming to be false. This creates a loop with no clear resolution, and it challenges how we understand truth and logic. Let's break it down with a bit more detail. The sentence, "This sentence is false," is self-referential, meaning it is talking about itself. When you read it, you are faced with two options. Either the sentence is true or it's false. If it's true, then the sentence is saying that it is false, which would make it false. But if it's false, then it's not true, which means it must be true because the sentence claims to be false. So, we end up in a loop where the sentence can't consistently be true or false. It contradicts itself no matter how you approach it. This self-referential nature is at the heart of the paradox. In most cases, when we deal with statements, we expect them to either be true or false. For example, the statement, "The sky is blue," is either true or false, depending on whether the sky is blue at that moment. There's no confusion about its truth value. But with self-referential statements like "This sentence is false," the usual rules of logic don't apply in the same way. The paradox forces us to confront the limits of how we think about truth and logic. This kind of paradox has been explored by many philosophers and logicians over the years. It is a reminder that our systems of logic are not always perfect, and some statements create situations where our usual rules break down. The paradox shows that when a statement refers to itself, it can create a logical problem that doesn't have a clear answer. The paradox of self-reference also shows up in other examples. Imagine a person who says, "I always lie." If this person is telling the truth, then they are lying because they claim to always lie. But if they are lying, then their statement must be true because they said they always lie. Again, we end up in a loop where it's impossible to figure out whether the statement is true or false. The person's statement contradicts itself, just like the sentence, "This sentence is false." Another example involves the liar paradox, where one person says, "This statement is false," and another person says, "The previous person is lying." The second statement makes us wonder whether the first person's statement is true or false. If the first person is lying, then their statement is true. But if their statement is true, then they must be lying. This creates confusion because both statements refer to each other in a way that causes contradictions. This paradox raises questions about how we define truth and how we structure logical systems. If we allow self-referential statements to exist in our system of logic, we might face contradictions like these. The paradox suggests that our current logical frameworks might not be equipped to handle certain types of statements. It shows the limitations of trying to categorize every statement as either true or false. If a statement refers to itself in a contradictory way, it challenges our idea of what it means for a statement to be true or false. In mathematical logic, this problem has practical implications. For example, the work of Kurt Gödel on incompleteness theorems relied on the concept of self-reference. Gödel showed that in any sufficiently complex logical system, there are statements that can't be proven true or false within the system itself. These statements are self-referential in nature, and they create a paradox similar to the "this sentence is false" paradox. Gödel's work demonstrated that no system of logic can be both complete and free from contradictions, a result that profoundly changed how mathematicians and logicians think about truth. The paradox of self-reference also plays a role in how we understand language and meaning. In natural language, we often use statements that refer to themselves, but they don't always lead to contradictions. For example, someone might say, "This sentence has 5 words." It's a self-referential statement, but it's not a paradox because it's straightforward and true. However, as soon as we introduce more complex ideas, like the one in the original paradox, we start to run into trouble. In everyday life, we encounter situations where self-reference causes confusion. For instance, imagine a rule that says, if you break the rule, you will be punished. What happens if you break the rule? Are you punished for breaking it, or does breaking the rule make the rule meaningless? If the rule is self-referential, it might lead to a situation where the meaning becomes unclear or contradictory. The paradox also has implications for how we understand decisions and responsibility. If someone says, "I will do the opposite of what I say," we are faced with a paradox. If they follow through and do the opposite, they are not doing what they said, but if they don't do the opposite, they are contradicting their own statement. This creates a loop where the statement cannot be consistent with itself. So, what does the paradox of self-reference tell us about logic and truth? It suggests that our systems of understanding may not be as reliable as we think, especially when we encounter statements that refer to themselves. The paradox forces us to ask whether we can truly rely on simple concepts of truth and falsehood when dealing with more complex, self-referential ideas. It reminds us that even in logical systems, things can get messy when we introduce self-reference, and sometimes there is no neat or clear answer to a problem. The paradox of self-reference challenges us to think carefully about the nature of statements, truth, and logic. It shows us that when a statement refers to itself in a contradictory way, our usual methods of determining its truth value may not work. The paradox doesn't have a simple solution, and it forces us to confront the limitations of logic and our understanding of truth. Whether in philosophy, mathematics, or everyday life, self-referential statements raise important questions about how we understand and process information. The paradox of time travel presents a compelling and complex question. If you could travel back in time, could you change the past? And if you did, would it lead to an alternate reality or create a loop that prevents any changes from happening? These questions stir up intriguing possibilities and contradictions, challenging how we think about time and causality. Let's imagine a time traveler who goes back in time to a moment in history. Suppose they travel to the past and attempt to stop a significant event, such as preventing a person from making an important decision or even saving someone from an accident. The question that arises is whether their actions can truly change the past. If they prevent an event, how does that affect the future they originally came from? If the time traveler successfully alters the past, does the future they left behind change as well? This brings us to the idea of alternate realities or timelines. If the time traveler changes something in the past, one possibility is that the change could create a new timeline. In this case, the original timeline would remain unchanged, and the time traveler would simply create a parallel reality where the new events play out. This is a popular way of thinking about time travel in science fiction, where every action taken in the past spawns a new version of reality. In this view, the time traveler's changes don't erase their original world, they just create another one. However, this creates its own set of problems. If there are multiple timelines, what happens when the time traveler returns to the future? Is the world they return to the same as the one they left? If they've created a new timeline, does it mean that their original timeline no longer exists? This idea can quickly get confusing, as the number of possible realities increases with every change made in the past. Another approach to the time travel paradox is the idea of consistency, or a self-correcting timeline. In this view, no matter what the time traveler does, the timeline will always correct itself to avoid paradoxes. For instance, if the time traveler tries to stop a person from making a certain decision, something else will occur to make sure that the decision happens anyway. The laws of time would force events to unfold in a way that prevents any contradictions. In this model, the time traveler might try to change the past, but their actions will always lead to the same outcome, ensuring that the timeline remains consistent. This kind of self-correcting timeline is often illustrated with the idea of a closed loop. For example, imagine a time traveler goes back to prevent the accident of a famous historical figure, but their interference ends up causing the accident to happen instead. This would mean that the time traveler's actions in the past were already part of the history that led to the future they came from. In a closed-loop system, it's impossible to change the past because any action that might alter it will, in some way, ensure that it doesn't actually change. A simpler way to understand this is to think about a person trying to stop a famous event. Like the assassination of a historical leader, the time traveler may try to prevent the assassination, but in the process, they accidentally cause the same event to happen, perhaps through a mistake or an unintended consequence. In this case, the timeline self-corrects by making sure that the event still occurs, even if the time traveler's original intent was to change it. It's like a set of dominoes. No matter how many times you try to stop one from falling, the chain will continue in some form. The idea of a self-correcting timeline leads to an interesting question about free will. If the timeline is fixed and can't be changed, does that mean we are not free to make choices? In this view, even though the time traveler might believe they are making independent decisions, they are simply following a path that is already determined by the events of the past. It suggests that while we may feel free to act, in reality, the future is already set, and our actions are part of a larger, unchangeable process. On the other hand, if time travel allows for real change, if the past can truly be altered, then this creates new questions about how the world would work. If you could change something significant in the past, how would that impact everything that came after it? Suppose the time traveler prevents the assassination of a leader, which results in a completely different course of history. Would the future, as the time traveler knew it, still exist? Or would the timeline they return to be entirely different from the one they came from? This idea leads to the concept of the butterfly effect, where small changes in the past can have large, unpredictable consequences. In the case of time travel, even the smallest action could drastically alter the future. If the time traveler prevents a seemingly minor event, it could have major repercussions that ripple through time. This could make time travel incredibly dangerous, as even well-meaning attempts to change the past could lead to unintended, chaotic consequences. Think about a simpler example. If you went back to the past and told someone a piece of information they weren't supposed to know, you might change the way they think or act. That person could then make a decision that leads to a chain of events that alters the course of history. The more you change in the past, the more uncertain the future becomes, leading to a future that is very different from the one you originally knew. This unpredictability makes time travel a fascinating and dangerous concept. It raises the question of whether we could truly control the past. Could we ever be certain that our actions in the past wouldn't cause a ripple effect that we could never predict? And if the future is shaped by these small changes, how can we ever know what might happen when we travel back? The paradox of time travel also brings us to a point where logic and imagination meet. If we believe that the future is predetermined, then time travel might not be possible at all. On the other hand, If we accept that changes to the past can create alternate realities, then we need to reconsider how time and causality work. Every choice made in the past could lead to a new timeline. But how do we deal with the complexities and contradictions that arise from multiple realities? Ultimately, the paradox forces us to think about the nature of time, change, and causality. Can we truly change the past when we travel backward? Or are we just part of a process that can't be altered? Whether time travel is a possibility or simply a theoretical exercise, it challenges our understanding of how the world works and how every action we take might impact the future. The Bootstrap Paradox, or time loop, is a thought experiment that challenges our understanding of causality and time. Imagine a scenario where an object is sent back in time, and that object is then used to inspire its own creation in the future. The object exists, but it never really has a clear origin. It was brought back in time, but it was also created because of the action of bringing it back. This creates a loop where the object appears to exist without ever having been created. The paradox forces us to think about how time works, how causality functions, and what happens when an event causes itself. Let's break it down with an example. Suppose someone in the future builds a time machine and decides to travel back in time. While they're in the past, they come across a book, a technical manual, about how to build the time machine. They bring this book back with them and use it to create the time machine in the future. The paradox arises when we ask, who wrote the book? The book exists in the future, where it's used to build the time machine, but it also exists in the past, where it is used as a reference to build the machine. In this case, the book never truly had an origin. It's both the cause and the effect of its own existence. This creates a closed loop. The book inspires the future time traveler to travel back, but it also exists because the time traveler brought it back. There's no clear starting point for the book. It exists, but it didn't really come from anywhere. It was sent back from the future, but it was also written in the past, inspired by its own existence. This paradox raises a deep question about causality. If the book is both the cause and the effect of itself, how can we explain its origin? How can something exist without being created? The Bootstrap Paradox gets its name from the phrase, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, which refers to a situation where something seems to create itself. In this case, the object, like the book, has no real origin. It is both the cause of its own creation and the effect of an action that occurs in the future. The paradox is confusing because we're used to thinking of cause and effect as following a clear, linear path. If something exists, there must be a cause that explains its creation. But with the Bootstrap Paradox, the object exists without any clear cause. It's like a cycle that feeds into itself. Imagine a different scenario. Let's say you go back in time and give a famous scientist a blueprint for a groundbreaking invention. The scientist then uses the blueprint to create the invention, which eventually leads to you being able to travel back in time and give them the blueprint. In this case, the blueprint exists because it was given to the scientist in the past, but it was also created because the scientist built it using that same blueprint. The paradox is that the blueprint doesn't really have an origin. It's both the cause and the effect of the invention. The cycle never has a clear beginning point. This paradox also raises questions about the nature of time. If events can loop back on themselves in this way, it challenges the idea that time moves in a straight line from the past to the present to the future. In a world governed by the Bootstrap Paradox, time doesn't seem to have a clear direction. Instead of events unfolding in a predictable order, the future can influence the past in a way that doesn't make sense in the traditional sense of cause and effect. This leads to the possibility of multiple timelines or realities, where each action leads to a self-sustaining loop that never has a clear origin. One way to think about the Bootstrap Paradox is to compare it to a puzzle. Imagine you're trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle. You have all the pieces in front of you, but there's no image on the box to guide you. As you put the pieces together, you realize that the puzzle itself is creating its own image. The image on the puzzle is the result of the pieces, but the pieces are also the result of the image. The puzzle seems to create itself, just as the object in the Bootstrap Paradox exists without being created by anyone or anything. This situation also raises questions about the possibility of free will. If the object exists because it was sent back in time, it seems to imply that events are fixed in a way that makes it impossible to change the past. The time traveler's actions are already part of the history that led to the object's creation, so nothing they do can change the fact that the object will exist. The paradox suggests that the future and the past are locked in a cycle that cannot be broken. However, there are different ways to approach this paradox. One solution might involve the idea of multiple timelines. In this model, the time traveler creates a new timeline each time they go back in time and interact with the past. The object or event created in the past exists in this new timeline, but the original timeline still exists separately. In this way, the paradox doesn't involve a single, unbroken timeline. Instead, it suggests that every time travel event creates a branching path where the past and future interact in ways that don't affect one another directly. Another solution involves the idea of consistency. In this view, the time traveler's actions must always lead to the same outcome. No matter what the time traveler does, they will always end up in the situation where they send the object back in time, creating a loop that prevents any change from occurring. The events are predetermined, and the time traveler is part of a larger pattern that maintains the consistency of history. The Bootstrap Paradox challenges our understanding of time, causality, and free will. It asks whether we can change the past or whether the future is already set, creating a loop that we can't escape. It also makes us think about the possibility of multiple timelines, where each action leads to a new reality that exists alongside the original one. The paradox forces us to consider the limits of our understanding of cause and effect, and to question whether time travel, if it were possible, would lead to contradictions that are difficult or impossible to resolve.